This week's Technique Tuesday video is an introduction to gauge. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So I want to start by defining what gauge is. Gauge is a term that's used in a couple of different ways for different purposes. So one of the ways that we use the term gauge is by describing the size of the stitches. So we might compare gauges. We might say something was worked at a smaller gauge and something was worked at a larger gauge. And when we say that, what we're talking about is small stitches versus big stitches. If you look at this fabric that I knit right here, this is a fingering weight yarn. You can see it's a thin yarn. And the ball band recommendation was 7 stitches per inch, or 28 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And it recommended a 2.5 millimeter needle, which is what the size needle is. So this is 7 stitches per inch, and we would call this a fine gauge fabric. So this is a worsted weight yarn. This is a mid-range yarn weight. It's a little bit thicker than DK or double knitting, which is used in the UK as their sort of mid-range yarn weight. But this is a very common yarn weight here in the United States. And this fabric was knit at 5 stitches per inch using a US 7 or 4.5 millimeter needle. And finally, we have this swatch here, which was knit with a bulky weight yarn at 3.5 stitches per inch, 14 stitches over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And it used this needle size. It used a US 10.5, which is a 6.5 millimeter needle. So in general, when we're talking about creating fabrics like this, a fabric that would be suitable for sweater knitting, for example, you have a thicker yarn, you use a bigger needle because the needle establishes how big the stitches are. An individual knitter might need a slightly different size needle to get this particular gauge. They might need to go a little bigger if they're a tight knitter, or they might need to go a little smaller if they're a loose knitter. But in general, thick yarn, big needle, thin yarn, little needle. You don't always knit a yarn to the gauge that's recommended on the ball band. That ball band recommendation is based on a stockinette sweater, and sometimes you want a fabric that has a different characteristic than standard stockinette fabric would have. So here is the same yarn as I knit here, but I knit it on a larger needle. In fact, I knit it using the same needle I used to knit the worsted weight yarn. Same needle, and actually I got the same stitch size, but this fabric is quite different from that one because this is a thinner yarn. So it's got a lot more drape. You can see that if I put it on my finger, it just bends in half, where if I put this on my finger, it's a little stiffer. It's not as bendy. This is a stiffer fabric than this is. So if I wanted to knit something with more drape to it, like a shawl, I might choose to use a larger needle with this thinner yarn. But then I knit the same yarn again using this larger needle, the same needle that I used to knit this thick fabric. And again, I got the same stitch size with this needle. I got 3.5 stitches per inch. But this fabric is practically like cheesecloth. You can see right through it. It stretches very easily. So I knit a sweater with this yarn. If I wanted to knit the same sweater at the same gauge and I used this yarn, besides being see-through, it wouldn't hold its shape. Gravity would pull it out of shape. There's so much room between the stitches that it's just not going to hold its shape. There might be some reason why I might want to knit something at this loose of a gauge, but it's probably not a sweater. We can go in the opposite direction when it comes to changing needle sizes as well. So this swatch was knit with bulky weight yarn using a US 10.5 needle. But if I can go down a smaller needle size in order to get a firmer gauge. So for this swatch, I used the same needle that I used to knit this swatch. And I did get a firmer gauge, but I didn't get the same gauge that I got here. And that's because a thicker yarn can only be squished so much, while a thinner yarn can be knit on larger and larger needles and just create more and more spaces between the stitches. With thicker yarns, you do run into a wall of how much things can be squished. So rather than getting 5 stitches per inch with this needle, I only got 4.5 stitches. My last test was to use this very thin 2.5 millimeter needle in order to knit this bulky weight yarn. And you can see I did manage to get a pretty fine gauge fabric here. It's also very firm. It doesn't stretch much at all, and it's practically bulletproof. I was able to get about 5.5 stitches per inch here rather than the 7 stitches per inch I got with the fingering weight yarn when I used this needle. When I was using this yarn, I could match the gauges of these two swatches that were knit with thicker yarn by using larger needles. But when I used this thicker yarn, I was not able to match the gauges of these thinner yarns when I used thinner needles. These swatches all have several things in common. First of all, they were all knit using the same yarn. They were all knit using the same needle. I cast on the same number of stitches for each of them, and I worked the same number of rows, and yet they are all very different in size. So they all have very different qualities in it. Those qualities have to do with how knits and purls interact with each other when they're worked on the same face of the fabric. With stockinette fabric, you have all of your knits on one side of the fabric and all of your purls on the other. But when you start changing things and you are working knits and purls on the same face of the fabric, depending on how they're arranged, that's going to cause the fabric to compress widthwise when it's relaxed, or it's going to compress lengthwise when it's relaxed, or it's going to keep it kind of static size. Most of these swatches, with the exception of these two, are able to stretch to the same maximum width. All of them can stretch to the same maximum width, but you'll see these are compressed more to begin with. These two swatches do not have the ability to stretch as wide as the rest of them do. They have things that cause them to be constrained in their ability to be more elastic. So it isn't just needle size that affects gauge, it's also your stitch pattern. In this video, I laid a foundation for understanding gauge by showing that thinner yarns are paired with smaller needles to produce finer gauge fabric, while thicker yarns are paired with larger needles to produce coarser gauge fabric. But we also saw that changing needle size for a given yarn will produce fabrics with different qualities, either more drape or more firmness. And finally, we saw that we can change stitch gauge with the same yarn and needles by changing stitch patterns. In the coming weeks, we'll explore this topic of gauge more thoroughly. We'll examine the process for making a yarn substitution in a project and how to adjust the pattern if our gauge is different than the pattern specifies. We'll also explore how to mix stitch patterns with different gauges when modifying patterns or designing our own. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.